Are there any questions?
Vale, pues...
Feel free to test my Spanish. It's very poor.
Invitamos a todo el mundo a plantear preguntas. Esta interesante intervención. Tendrá que ser con el micrófono, si no. Vamos a ver si estamos ahí. ¿Dónde se dice esto, Jesús? Así que no te está dando mucho, pero voy a contestar.
Muy bien.
Sí, está bien.
And can the interpreter?
Should I speak in English or is it better that I speak in Spanish?
No, whatever you feel comfortable with. Can the interpreters hear the roving microphone? Very good, yes. Shoot, whatever.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conference. I really enjoyed it. And I had a question in relation to the non-cognitive aspects of this intraseminary interpretation. So I was wondering, because I'm trying to look at these theories on reception, or perception rather. So the perception of different accents, different pronunciations, and how much it is being targeted in interpretation studies. I'm not unclear about that.
Very clear, yes, but you said the non-cognitive aspects, right?
Yes, in terms of perception of these
yes.
first, oral nature of language.
So that starting at the end of your question, which is a very good one, the notion of accent in perception and comprehension is very much a much researched and then a very relevant and interesting topic in interpreting research for several reasons. One main reason that you will come across when you read some of that literature is ELF, English as a lingua franca. And the assumption that people, and we've just actually heard an example of that, the speaker from Sweden, they usually speak English very well in Sweden, but you notice that there were some strange peculiarities. There is an accent, there's a foreign accent, and so with the use of English as a lingua franca, not only in the United Nations, but really internationally, and often a reduction in the number of working languages offered. Sometimes there's only English and Spanish and French and nothing else. Everybody else has to speak one of those languages. You get lots of foreign accents in interpreting, and it's an important topic. There is research that goes back 10 or 20 years when they surveyed conference interpreters, what is the most difficult thing for you? What's your challenge? And they say speed and accent, or not getting the documents. So high speed and difficult accent, sometimes they come in combination. Definitely, like think of Asian speakers, sometimes very difficult Korean speakers that I've had that I couldn't follow, or Japanese, Chinese. It's not, we shouldn't stereotype, but there's also quite a fair share in my personal experience, sorry for saying this, of Spanish speakers whom I found in English, whom I found very difficult to understand. But it's of course present company accepted, but it happens that people have very thick accents, and so yes, it's one of the most fascinating topics, and there is some literature. Andrew Chung, for instance, in Hong Kong has published several studies, experimental work on the role of accent, and Cheung, Cheung. Andrew Chung is quite in some of the work that was published and edited by colleagues here in Granada, the Almuñécar conferences on quality in interpreting. Andrew actually participated and contributed papers, so you can find it even in Comares publications, a paper on accent as an important feature, and or whatever you read about English as a lingua franca that usually has to do with unfamiliar accents. I've also supervised a number of master's theses where we expose people to certain accents and then let them rate the accents. How heavy is the accent and how easy would it be to interpret that speaker? Interesting findings. There is, for instance, also the so-called interlanguage, the interlanguage speech intelligibility benefit. What it means is, if you interpret as a Spanish A interpreter, you have to interpret somebody who speaks Spanish, who speaks English, but who is actually sharing your A language. You will have an easier time because you can relate to the deviations and to the style of pronunciation. So you have an advantage if you share some of the languages of the speaker speaking with a different accent in English as a lingua franca. All sorts of studies, master's thesis level, revolving around the notion of accent. So that's a very good topic. The only thing I'm puzzled about is, why would this be a non-cognitive issue? Because there is perception, but you need to process it. It's about understanding, and to me it is, understanding is kind of the ultimate cognitive process in a way in interpreting. So I would see it as a cognitive issue also.
Just because recently I was reading a book by David Abraham about perception, and he was more into the phenomenology of language. And I don't know if you've heard about Merleau-Ponty from 1970s, I think. Writing, he was one of Saussure the students, and he would be looking into this relationship between the body as a sound box and the environment. So it was very inspiring, I must say. And I don't know if this kind of research is being followed, because I think it's a bit out of what is being done. And they would say that's not cognitive.
Okay, thank you. Not that I'm familiar with, but you've again added a very inspiring point, because you said the embodiment of speaking, and there is a strong trend nowadays to not separate cognition as something that happens between the brain cells and your body. The notion is actually called embodied cognition. So it's a very strong current that we don't want to separate. Whatever is cognitive is also embodied, and whatever has to do with perception and the body and your vocal cords also relates to what you do cognitively when you speak or listen. So it's an interesting phenomenon. So I would want to bring those together, and I would have a hard time saying this is not cognitive, because ultimately anything is cognitive. If we see something, process something, remember something, we need to use the brain and the rest of our body to deal with that as interpreters or as language users. So thank you, very, very interesting question. If the specific point is about accent, that is still a hot topic, and it'll get even hotter and interesting to look into that. For instance, with this speech, interlanguage speech intelligibility benefit that also helps interpreters. Other questions? Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I wanted to know your opinion about the future of interpreting, because we're often told that AI and artificial intelligence is going to replace us eventually, and we're quite concerned about that. So basically, I just wanted to know what you think, because from everything we've seen today with the presentation, I think it's really hard for a machine to really get to know what the context is and all about it. So from my point of view, I don't think it's ever going to be able to replace us. But that's what we're told now. So I just wanted to know.
I thank you for the question. But who told you so? Who told you so? If it's among
Many people.
If it's among your instructors, no. Absolutely, yes. Just joking. No, people tend to believe that also about translation. Translators are no longer needed, and because the machines can do it. And with interpreters, the threshold is a bit higher. They figure that, it might be more difficult, spontaneous expression. But okay, I think the positive answer, the encouraging answer is interpreters will never be replaced in certain settings for some purposes and demands. But if you pushed me hard and kind of switched off the recording, I would venture a guess of which kinds of interpreting might be more susceptible to being taken over by machine translation, because it's actually machine translation, not machine interpreting. And actually what we've heard about, pardon me for saying that, about the United Nations and prepared reports that are all there in writing, that are read out. They could easily be scanned, fed into the database, also then with speech recognition getting better. I think these formal, prepared speeches with an established terminology, because the United Nations has a very effective conference service, everything is well documented and prepared beforehand, that is more susceptible to automation, unfortunately, than spontaneous speech discussions, or especially when we widen the circle to include community-based settings, refugee asylum hearings, police interviews, doctor-patient communication. I don't see it happening anytime soon in our or any lifetime. So interpreters are needed, but if you take this seriously, then we will at least have to accept that there will be a shift in the overall interpreting market. It depends on countries, regions, of course. For instance, in Latin America or in China, the market for conference interpreting seems to be still buoyant, because there's a much greater need. But in Europe, for instance, with the spread of English as a lingua franca, there hasn't been further growth in the conference market, especially not for technical conferences, scientific conferences. That has gone down very sharply because people are using English sufficiently. So the market is changing, even though changes are regional. But overall, there is a shift, I would say, toward more community-based types of interpreting. And if we're open to that, the basic question, will interpreters be replaced, can clearly be answered with no, because there are these other needs. But in some established settings where interpreting started in a big sense in the 50s and 60s, I'm not so sure. And there are other needs arising, and one of my favorite topics recently is speech-to-text interpreting for hard of hearing persons. There are legal foundations that persons with disabilities who can't hear what speakers are vocalizing have a right to have support services, and these support services come in the form of simultaneous interpreting from speech into written text. So what I'm speaking would be appearing there on a screen or on a tablet of a hard of hearing person. Yeah, sorry about that. It's switched off. So there is a new form of language service that is even intralingual. So you'd be working from English spoken to English written, but the process is very much simultaneous. You sit there, you listen, and simultaneously you speak into a speech recognition software, and that software turns your carefully articulated dictation into reliable written text. We all know there's automatic speech recognition, and it's getting better day by day, but it's still not completely reliable, and some of the worst misunderstandings can happen, and some very embarrassing mistakes that you can see on YouTube or Google. So it's not good enough, and especially when we think ethically about the needs, communication needs of disabled persons, we can't say, oh, it's good enough for them. You know, they'll get 80% of the message. So ethically, they deserve as much highly professional communication as hearing persons, and for that reason we will need humans to ensure these communication access services. And I think it's a fascinating new market that has opened up, and I can tell you that many of our graduates from the Vienna conference interpreting track they practice simultaneous interpreting, then they do a course introducing them to speech to text interpreting, and they have the skills of simultaneous listening and processing and monitoring and editing. It's a very complicated, a very challenging task, even though you often do it intralingually. You don't have to translate between languages, and they find jobs with broadcasting companies for live subtitling, or with educational institutions for hard of hearing students in different universities, more easily than graduates who want to say, I want to be a conference interpreter and I'm looking for my first clients. Some end up in Brussels, yes, but it's not a hugely growing market. So overall, markets are shifting, but there are new opportunities, new social needs, new technology-based interpreting services, if I may call it that, that we can take advantage of. Some established professional bodies still refuse to accept speech-to-text interpreting as interpreting. I'm liberally using it. I believe that it can be described and characterized as a translational activity that we can call interpreting. But it's, of course, a mind shift to say, when I work within one language, can I call myself an interpreter?
So, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation, and I would like to highlight some aspect that you mentioned about, for example, the process of communication and how sometimes interpreters are overlooked or used to be overlooked in that process of communication. And as for community interpreting, for example, do you think that it would be better for the communication process to admit that the interpreters are actually there, that they are an active part of the communication, and not to just pretend that we are not there, and such a pressure on us to be, like we are usually taught to be invisible. And that is also like to speak in all the time in first person instead of third person. And so do you think that would take that pressure away from the interpreters and make the communication better, or it turn out to be just too colloquial and then in turn not so adequate for the situation? I'd like to know your insights.
Thank you very much for an excellent question, and the answer can be very short and clear: yes. Yes, I absolutely think that it's in community-based dialogue settings. There's no point in trying to be invisible. It's pointless, because you're there, and even what you dress, what you wear is going to shape the situation. If somebody breaks out in tears and you're also a human being, and how can you say, I'm neutral, I'm a machine, I'm just a robot? So we have actually said goodbye to that assumption quite a long time ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago. Research has well established that in these dialogic situations, we're interactants, that's for sure. We don't have a communicative goal ourselves. We don't want to communicate. Our goal is to help others communicate, but we're still involved actively in the interaction, and there's no need to try to stay in the background or be invisible. The question is, of course, our main mission is to enable interaction between other people. And if we are very active and try to shape and interfere too much, obviously we're not serving our real purpose. So the purpose is not to be invisible or neutral, but just to make sure that communication happens and functions. And very often I think this could imply that we don't interfere whenever things are smoothly, and we limit ourselves to translating utterances and making sure that there is understanding. But if there is misunderstanding, we said, wait a minute, I think there's a problem. That's intervening at the right moment. That's not invisible, that's being active, but only when it's necessary. So a good professional interpreter may not be very visible, but will be ready to intervene whenever it's it's judged to be professionally necessary in a community-based setting or even in a conference. So yes, the notion of invisibility or neutrality, I think research has shown that it's not really possible, and it's not meaningful, and it's based on reports by interpreters in psychotherapy for victims of torture, for instance. It's so clear that you're there as a human being. Nobody would claim that they are not there, even when they're connected via video conference. So that's for sure. So actually enlarging our scope and taking these other types of settings more seriously helps us come to that realization that invisibility is a fiction, is a myth, that it's only maybe being protected by glass walls in an interpreting booth that leads us to assume that we are not seen. But sometimes people do turn around and they see us, and we want to be seen, we want to be acknowledged by the speaker, who at the end of the session thanks the interpreters. And so yes, we want to be present, we are there, we are involved in the interaction, and that's a good thing for the profession, so that we, But if we do our job well, if they don't notice us very much in a conversation, that's also fine. I mean, our purpose is not to be at the center of communication. We are very much a serving profession, offering a professional service. Thank you very much for that question. So, goodbye to invisibility.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Nada. Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas, y en nombre también del máster del MUI, pues darte nuevamente las gracias por esta conferencia sumamente interesante, como ya estamos acostumbrados. Siempre ha sido muy interesante cuando has estado aquí, y muy... Bueno, quizás algunos que otros que no estamos muy acostumbrados a ver cuestiones desde un punto de vista más teórico, ¿no?, de investigación, pues igual a algunos que otros les ha entrado la gana de meterse un poco en este mundo, ¿no?, de la investigación. Y bueno, muchas gracias, y esperemos que no sea la última vez que tenemos aquí.
Thank you. I look forward to it. Thank you for being such an interesting audience also. Thanks to the interpreters, of course. Thank you. I hope it was manageable.